Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I certainly appreciate you watching today. I have a great group of stories from several different books. It's about a subject that I am passionate about, and that's temple work. President Nelson has said that the Lord is hastening his work to gather Israel, that the gathering of Israel is the most important thing taking place on earth today. Nothing else compares in importance. Nothing else compares in majesty. Most of the gathering of Israel will take place in the temples of the Lord. Hundreds are now on the earth. Thousands will be on the earth during the millennium. Most of the people that we do temple work for accept that work. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 119, the prophet Joseph Smith received a commandment from the Lord. He was commanded to build a house of prayer, a house of fasting, a house of faith, a house of learning, a house of glory, a house of order, a house of prayer. But at the time, the saints in Kirtland were terribly poor. Brigham Young acknowledged that the church members were too few in number, too weak in faith, and too poor in purse to attempt such a mighty enterprise. But by the means of all these stimulants, a mere handful of men, living on air and on a little hominy and milk, the great prophet Joseph Smith in the stone quarry, quarrying rocks with his own hands, and a few then in the church, following his example of obedience and diligence wherever needed. Brother Heber J. Grant described how everyone was involved with working on the temple. My wife had toiled all summer long in lending her aid towards the temple's accomplishment. She took 100 pounds of wool to spin on shares in order to furnish clothing for those who were laboring in the house of the Lord. She spun and wove and got the cloth dressed and cut and made up into garments, and gave them to the laborers on the temple. Almost all the sisters in Kirtland labored in knitting, sewing, spinning, etc. for the same purpose. The whole church united in this great undertaking, and every man lent a hand. Those who had not teams went to work in the stone quarry and prepared the stones for drawing to the house of the Lord. The prophet, being our foreman, put on his toe frock and his toe pants and would go into the quarry, the presidency, the high priests, and the elders all alike assisting. Those who had teams assisted in drawing the stone to the house of the Lord. These all laboring one day in the week brought as many stones to the house as supplied the masons throughout the week. We continued in this manner until the walls of the house were reared, and they built the Kirtland Temple. It was an amazing undertaking. At the time, it's considered the costliest temple that was ever built by the Latter-day Saints. It's estimated to have cost just over $40,000. Compared with the saints' income and assets, it represented a larger portion than has ever been used to build a temple by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The plans for the temple were revealed to the first presidency, and Joseph Smith received a revelation, and this is what he says about that. Joseph received the word of the Lord for him to take his two counselors, Williams and Rigdon, and come before the Lord, and he would show them the plan or model of the house to be built. We went upon our knees, called on the Lord, and the building appeared within viewing distance. I being the first to discover it, then all of us viewed it. After we had taken a good look at the exterior, the building seemed to come right over us, and it enveloped them, and they were able to see every detail of the interior of that temple, which I thought was an amazing revelation. The Lord magnifies our efforts as we work in the temple, not just in the temple work itself, but in all aspects of our lives. I've received a powerful witness of this during the 27 years I've been a temple worker. I believe that temple blessings are more pronounced than tithing blessings. And believe me, I have a powerful testimony of tithing. But the Lord reimburses us heartily and bountifully for working in the temple. In 1916, the construction of the temple in Oahu began, and the man in charge of the temple had a vision. It couldn't be built the way the Hawaiians had traditionally built their buildings, out of local timber, but it had to be built of cement so that it could stand during the millennium. So he arranged for a rock crusher to be delivered to the temple site, and they brought lava rock, which was abundant in the area, and crushed it and used the aggregate to make their cement. When we read a few things about what happened in the temple in Oahu, men drove teams of horses to the riverbeds in the mountains back of Laia and hauled rocks to the temple site. The rocks were used in the thick foundations of the temple to give it strength in place of those corals found there. Excavation necessary for the temple foundation was done with pick and hand shovels. The men worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they received $1.25 a day for their efforts. However, they ran into some real problems. There was not enough timber available on the islands, and all the ships at that time in World War I had been taken over and were being used by the military to supply the war efforts in Europe. Brother Ralph Woolley was the supervisor on the temple, and he got to an impasse where they couldn't continue. They had finished the walls of the temple and had to do the framing and the interior structure, and they had no lumber to do it. So he went up into the upper room of the structure that they had at that point, and he knelt down in the belfry and poured out his soul to the Lord and told him that he had to have help to get lumber. And miraculously, a ship that was carrying lumber to Honolulu got off course. The ship got stuck on a reef in Laia's Bay, and Brother Woolley contacted the shipping company and the lumber company, and they told him they had no idea how they were going to get this ship off the reef, that it was stuck, and that if he could unload the lumber, it would possibly help them to get their ship back. And so the missionaries and the local saints swam out to this ship. They threw the lumber off into the ocean. They tied it together into rafts, and then the strength of the waves pushed that lumber as the saints guided it back to the shore. And that was how we got the lumber for the roofing structure of the temple in Oahu. Just like that story, the Lord won't do the work for us, but he will be behind us and pushing us along. I started as an ordnance worker in the Provo Temple in 1997. I've been self-employed all my life as a builder, and at the time I was working with John Curtis as a scoutmaster. We had a large group of boys, and we took them on a monthly outing. And so I had a lot of responsibility in my church calling, and my wife and I felt like it was really a strain, and we wondered if I could afford to take 1 day a week and work at the temple. But I felt compelled to do it, and it soon became very obvious to us that the Lord compensates you for the work you do at the temple. I was generously given back the time that I lost at work. Entropy, or Murphy's Law as it's referred to, is a very real thing to anyone that's in the construction industry, because you're opposing entropy. You're trying to make order out of disorder. And it seems that everything that can go wrong quite often does. And if you're cutting tile and you have to cut tile on this side of the room, when you get over to that side of the room, the piece that's left over never is quite big enough. It's usually about a ½ inch short. But once I started working at the temple, not only was the piece for the other side of the wall big enough, but frequently it was the right size and didn't even need to be cut. One time I bid a job to finish a basement, and I thought the basement had 8-foot ceilings, and they were 8'5". I had to buy 10-foot studs, and they're quite a bit more expensive. And not only do you have to buy more expensive studs, but at the 8-foot mark, you have to put a fire blocking in. So there's a horizontal 2x4 between each stud. So the fellow that was working with me that day, I said, Jeff, grab those 2x4 scraps and start cutting them to put between these studs. And he picked them up and he measured them and he started and he goes, well, do I have to cut them? I go, well, yeah, they have to fit. And they fit exactly. We just picked those scraps up and nailed them in place. They were the perfect size. And the Lord did so many things on my job sites like that the men that worked on jobs with me got sick of me pointing out, here's another temple blessing, because it became obvious to everyone on my jobs that things were different when they worked with me. Not only does the Lord compensate us abundantly for the work we do at the temple, but he protects the people that work on the temple. I have a couple of great stories from the Logan Temple I'd like to share. On September 30th of 1879, Brother Hugh McKay was placing a 15-pound stone, and he was up really high on a scaffolding, 5 stories. And as he stepped back to put the stone in place, he missed the scaffolding and tumbled down and landed on a pile of stone rubble 48 feet below where he had stood. He got up, dusted himself off. They got the doctor. The doctor was worried he might have internal injuries. They sent him home. He had a sprained ankle. He had a good-sized gash on one arm and on his fingertips. And 11 days later, Brother McKay returned and worked full-time at the temple as a stonemason until the walls were finished. When the exterior walls and the roof structure were finished, they had to build a huge scaffolding, 100 feet tall, to plaster the insides of the temple. They didn't have scaffolding structure like we have now, that components that plug together and bracing and everything. They had to build it all out of timbers. On August 11th, 1883, 3 men were up on the scaffolding plastering. 1 was a tender and 2 were plasterers. And the entire 100-foot tall scaffolding gave way. Brother John Knowles fell 53 feet and landed on the stairs on his back. They took him to the office because he was dead. Brother Julius Smith fell 45 feet. He got a 3-inch gash on one hand and tore his ear. He was able to return to work a week later. The tender, Lars Strandquist, tumbled down, hitting timbers as he went, and he ended up suspended upside down, tangled in the last of the scaffolding that had come down, and they had to help him out, and he received minor injuries. But to go back to Brother Knowles, the man that fell 53 feet, 2 years later, he described his experience that day to Joshua Salisbury, and this is what he said. I landed so hard that it bounced my spirit right out of my body. I want to tell you that my spirit will never be more free from my body when the Lord calls me home than it was that day. I could see my dead body laying there on the stairs. I could hear every word that was said. My dead body was carried into the office and laid on the couch. Brother John Perry, the construction superintendent, asked one of the men to go get you, Brother Salisbury, and said, we will administer to him and then send him home. And I don't believe they intended to send home a body. I saw you, Brother Salisbury, fully half a block away, coming up the path from the place where you had been cutting stone for the temple. As you walked, you brushed the stone dust off your sleeve and trousers. You came into the office, poured some water from the pitcher into the basin, washed your face and hands, then combed your hair and whiskers. Then Brother Perry said, we will administer to him, Brother Salisbury. When you said your prayer, in the name of Israel's God, we command you to be made whole. My spirit entered my body, and I opened my eyes. After it was all over, they put me in the buggy and took me home. I think that's an amazing story. But back to the early temples and the experiences they had at the Kirtland Temple, the mobs were constantly on the attack. Brigham Young describes the situation. He said, laborers on the wall were holding the sword in one hand to protect themselves from the mob, while they placed the stone and moved the trowel with the other. It was a scene of constant harassment, and Joseph Smith had to be guarded by a group of men to protect him from the mobs, because they were after him night and day. And this is a tender story that took place. At a time when Joseph was guarded day and night by his brethren from mob violence, that he might perform his necessary business labors and get the necessary night's rest, and that his life should be saved, he was in a log house at night. Several brethren were with him and were making arrangements to see who would take which shift to stand guard that night. Joseph was listening to the prayer of a little boy in the next room. The boy tenderly prayed for the prophet, that he might be secure and safe from his enemies, the mob, that night. When the boy had done praying, Joseph turned to his brethren and told them to all go to bed and sleep, and get a good night's rest, for the Lord had heard the boy's prayers and would answer them. They all went to bed and slept soundly through the night and were safe in the morning. Unseen forces also protected the saints in their efforts. In January 1836, prior to the completion of the temple, Joseph Smith reported that Elder Roger Orton saw a mighty angel riding upon a horse of fire, with a flaming sword in his hand, followed by 5 others, encircling the house and protecting the saints, even the Lord's anointed, from the power of Satan and the hosts of evil spirits which were striving to disturb the saints. So the Lord really did watch out for these people and bless them and help them. I have one more story I wanted to share today that really shows the dedication of everyone involved with the temple building. This one actually takes place in Nauvoo. It was Temple Tithing Day. They had 2 tithings in Nauvoo, the regular tithing on one's increase or earnings, and the other on time, so that each person was expected to work every 10th day on the temple without pay. This boy's father had hitched his team to his wagon and with his son had gone to the quarry to load a large stone into the wagon. Then they started for the temple. Pulling out of the quarry with its stone floor was no problem, but when they started across the flat, their wagon became stuck in a mud hole. The father whipped the horses, and they lurched forward against their collars. But this sudden pull merely jiggled the wagon and made it sink deeper into the mire. The father handed his reins to his son, telling him to stay with the team, while he went up to the temple and secured someone to come down with a team or 2 of oxen and pull his wagon out of the mud. His father had just stepped off the wagon into the deep mud when a man walking along the side of the street called to him and said, "I see you're having trouble, Brother Bybee." "Yes," he said, "I'm going to the temple to get someone to help pull me out." The man waded into the mud and said to the father, "Brother Bybee, you get by the left wheel and put your right shoulder under a spoke. I'll get my left shoulder under a spoke of the right wheel." Then he turned to the 9-year-old boy and said, "Get your whip ready, and when I say lift, we'll lift with our shoulders, and you don't spare the horseflesh." So saying, each in position, the man said, "Lift." Each man did his part. The horses jumped at the sting of the whip, and the wagon moved a bit, and the horses were able to keep it going. After going about 100 feet onto dry ground, the boy let the team rest. The 2 men caught up with the wagon, and as Brother Bybee climbed up to the driver's seat and took the reins from his son, he called out, "Thank you, Brother Joseph." The boy had been greatly impressed that a prophet of the Lord, on his way to pay his temple tithing and labor, was not above wading in mud halfway to his knees and getting covered with mud as he put his shoulder to the wheel and helped this man in distress. Again, President Nelson has said, "The Lord is hastening his work to gather Israel." That is the most important thing taking place on earth today. Nothing else compares in importance. Nothing else compares in majesty. It's a work that requires manpower. We have billions of ordinances that need to be done for God's children. And I promise you, as you participate in temple work, the Lord will reward you bountifully. He will bless your mind. He will bless your spirit. He will multiply your labors, and he will bless your family here on earth and through eternity. I know temple work is the Lord's work on the earth, and I hope that I have motivated more people to come join us as we labor in the house of the Lord. It's a wonderful work to be involved with. You feel the Lord's love for you, and you frequently feel the love of the people you're working for while you do it. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it today. If you enjoyed this story, you might enjoy this one. Other people watch all of them. You can find them here. Thanks again.